Good afternoon, everyone. Today we have Malaysia with us. And before we start, can everyone sign in at the front desk after the talk? So Dr. Malaysia Kenney is the Associate Director of Knowledge Initiatives at University of Minnesota Institute on the Environment, where she directs efforts to build synergy across the Institute's broad scientific research portfolio. She is an environmental design scientist with expertise in multiple disciplinary team-based science approaches to solving sustainability challenges. Her research broadly addresses how to integrate both scientific knowledge and social values into policy decision-making under uncertainty. Her research expertise include conceptual modeling and design structuring, indicators, system analysis, multi-attribute methods, and evaluation of design support to address environmental policy decisions. Over the past decade, her work has led to more than 50 publications and more than 5 million in grants, more than 100 invited talks, including at the National Academies of Science, and multiple invited White House events integrating her research findings. In addition to research, she has extensive experience in high-level science policy coordination and relationship building between federal and academic institutes. She was a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow. In recognition of her public engagement leadership, she was part of the inaugural cohort of AAAS National Leadership Institute Public Engagement Fellows, where she focused on enhancing stakeholder-engaged research to create climate-resilient solutions in the U.S. and Chesapeake Bay region. She is also an associate research professor in ethics. Previously, she was research faculty in the Department of Geography and Environmental Engineering at Johns Hopkins University, and a postdoc scholar with the National Center for Earth Surface Dynamics at the University of Minnesota and Johns Hopkins University. She received her PhD from Duke University, focused on integrating water quality and design models. So let's welcome Malaysia.
Thank you. Thank you all. Yeah, so in case you haven't heard the news, I have a new job. I'm actually not funded by University of Maryland via my grants anymore. I'm now at the University of Minnesota in the Institute on the Environment, where we're looking to develop a way of really advancing some major sustainability goals, including carbon neutrality, safe drinking water, and sustainable land use, to really provide a model for the world. And so I'm really excited to actually share with you just a snippet of what I've been doing here at Maryland, and to give you a preview of what I'm going to be doing moving forward, in part because I'm not going anywhere. I'm still an affiliate here, and I still have collaborations with colleagues here in Essex and at the University of Maryland, and I'm looking forward to continuing my research program in collaboration with a number of you all. So in case you don't know about my research group, we're really unusual within the Earth System Science Interdisciplinary Center because we're a multidisciplinary social science research group. We work on a range of different environmental problems, from coastal resilience to interdependent infrastructure, climate change and adaptation, environmental restoration, and water quality. If it's hard and it's related to the environment, that's what we like to do. We do environmental decision support science. So what that means is we think about both the tools, like models, scenarios, indicators, as well as processes, the ways that we engage amongst multiple scientific groups as well as stakeholders to really advance the use of evidence in decision making by both public and private sector organizations. So we don't look at individual scale, we really look at organizations like federal agencies, state agencies, and private industries. So when I talk about this, as I mentioned, because we're talking about decision support, we're working on problems. And the unique thing about problems is that they're not owned by one particular discipline. To really solve problems, we need a range of different disciplinary perspectives. And so a lot of what my team does is we bring team-based science to think about how we integrate those multiple disciplinary insights and fields, the different epistemologies and the ways that we think about it, so that we can think about how that feeds into solving those big problems. Additionally, because these problems aren't only exclusive to the academy, we work a lot with stakeholders in the public to understand their information needs, their problems, their values, and how we can tailor and provide information in ways that's meaningful and useful, which means that we're looking at understanding how do they understand and interpret and use scientific information so that we can understand the pathways to increase its use in their decision making. And then finally, we work a lot with decision makers and policymakers. This means that we're interested in both understanding how they frame and contextualize the problem, but also how we can develop and evaluate decisions and decision support systems so that we can understand how those decisions are made and how we can best aid those decisions. So when we look across our team's research portfolio and what I've led over the past decade or so, we've worked on a lot of different problems. We've worked on participatory indicators for the U.S. National Climate Assessment, environmental standards and the non-market benefits of environmental improvements. We've worked on looking at trade-off analyses and improving the ways that we constrain the problems for very large billion-dollar restoration projects. We've looked at how we can increase resilience for interdependent built nature-based and cultural infrastructure solutions and how we can develop ways to help people become better prepared. We're looking at approaches to de-bias expert probability assessments. If you kind of want to know disciplinary stuff, you can get deep into the management science literature on that, but we're not going to talk about it today. Worked on a new initiative related to ecological forecasting, just had a Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences paper come out this past year that really set a direction for the field that's being built out. And then lastly, improving the understandability of indicators and forecasts. So how can we actually provide this kind of modeling and information so that people understand it and then ideally use it? So we're not going to talk about all of those today. But what I do want to talk about is something that I've worked on while I've been here at KICS, and it was actually what brought me here from Johns Hopkins in the first place. And that's really thinking about how we develop indicators for the U.S. National Climate Assessment by engaging a broader community of scientists and stakeholders. So the U.S. National Climate Assessment is like the IPCC for the U.S. It's an assessment document that is required by the 1990 Global Change Research Act, and it has to be produced no less than once every 4 years. It requires an assessment across a broad range of sectors, and as part of the third National Climate Assessment, which I was an author on and conducted research for, part of the recommendations were to develop ways of sustaining and providing decision support products that would bridge between the different assessment reports. And that's for two reasons. One is people don't make decisions just when those assessment reports come out, and they could use that kind of updated information to be able to inform their decisions. And things like the National Climate Assessment and IPCC report are really important catalysts for being able to move some of the information, the impacts, into the broader sphere. The second reason why a more sustained set of products or decision support tools can be quite useful is that it creates economic efficiencies. just think about having to spin up and start up every single time for once in every 4-year assessment, a new set of, scenarios and indicators and other products. If you don't have a system in place that allows for you to build off of what you've already done, you're recreating the wheel every single time, and that just doesn't make a lot of sense. So one of the things that my team proposed was actually thinking about a set of indicators. And these you can think about as some of the core graphics that tell us about changes that are happening within the climate as well as within impacts. Impacts on our ecosystems, impacts on our social systems, and what we're doing to respond to those impacts. So we envision this to be a system of physical, ecological, and societal indicators that could help us to understand key aspects of climate changes, impacts, vulnerabilities, and how we're preparing for this. Unique to this effort, and a number of you all are already familiar with a lot of these indicator systems that exist within like NASA's vital signs or NOAA's products, there's a lot of things that really provide a strong baseline for the physical climate changes that have or will be occurring in the future. What we propose is actually expanding on that model to really think about a lot of the indicators that are multi-stressor, where climate is one of the stressors that really impact the changes that we're seeing in our ecosystems or social systems. And that's because some of those indicators are the ones that are most decision relevant as we think about climate mitigation and adaptation. One of the things that I think was particularly important to this effort was that we didn't try to constrain the way that these indicators were framed either spatially or temporally. So you could almost think about these as really allowing the science and the data to drive the scale of the indicator. Additionally, because this is being developed for an assessment report produced by multiple federal agencies in the scientific community, there's no way that you could customize and build a decision support system that would feed into every single particular decision. If someone tells you they can do that, they're lying. And so that means what we wanted to do was we wanted to provide these analytical tools, basically these really robust metadata systems, so that people could replicate them and they could derive indicators based off of what we did for their own particular purposes. So again, this was really figuring out ways of customizing it without like the federal agencies having to take the heavy lift on it, but instead empowering the private sector or decision makers to really be able to customize it for their own uses. So as part of this effort, here's what I did at ASIC, amongst 6 or 7 other projects. So we did a lot of things with scoping. We had teams of over 200 scientists. We did framing. We developed guidance for federal agencies. And the biggest thing is we actually developed a framework and the infrastructure to be able to actually set up and deploy this indicator system in a robust way that was scientifically defensible, but pragmatically useful for federal agencies to actually develop it. And that kind of like marrying of an academic ideal with the pragmatic realities, that's our sweet spot. Because for our team, there's no use in sort of developing things that are theoretical that don't end up getting used. But if someone else can develop it, if a consulting firm can do it, that's not what our team works on. We work on the use-inspired science where we can develop novel insights given the pragmatic realities of where our decision-making bodies are at this moment. So a couple of noteworthy publications. We had one in Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment, really promoting this idea of an indicator system. We produced a process-based paper. How did we actually organize 200 scientists and 9 federal agencies and an entire federal advisory committee to like adopt a system, recommendations for a system of indicators. And then we recently came out this past year with a document that provides sort of the overview recommendations, and this is the seminal paper in a special issue that I'm guest editing with Tony Genados at Boston University, where all of our 14 different teams are producing papers that help us to give a sense of what this indicator system can look like and how people could customize it on international to local scales. So what this looks like is, this is a combination of, again, process and product. So the process was really developing an operational approach to how to develop indicators. And so we're going to step through this wheel diagram that takes us from developing to identifying, synthesizing, reviewing, beta launching, research, and having, well, I guess, final products, if you can ever call them those. So first, the development process. So one of the things that was really crucial to our method was the use of conceptual models. These are ways of describing the system that we're focused on, and one of the things that was unique about using them for indicators is that it gives really clear guidance to someone from outside of the team about what the team viewed as important, where they drew the boundaries of the system, and what aspects of the system they viewed as important for this effort. So to give you a sense of what our effort looked like, we had basic physical climate indicators related to atmospheric composition, physical climate change. We had indicators related to terrestrial systems in ag, grasslands, and forests. The aquatic systems for oceans and coasts, water cycle, water resources, and freshwater ecosystems. And we had the built environment looking at energy and the environment. We also had human health, which sort of sits in between these different groupings. Phenology, because that links into terrestrial, and it should also have a link into aquatic, but it's sort of a different category in of itself. We pulled that out as one of the categories of indicators that was particularly unique to make sure that we included within our system. And then we had more of our aspirational indicators related to climate adaptation, mitigation, where currently the field is really good at accounting, so identifying things that are being done, but not necessarily getting as much to the effectiveness, especially for adaptation. Building on that, what we ended up doing was creating groupings of indicators one would expect to see. Now, for those of you who have expertise in any one of these things, such as sea ice, what you would notice is that that's not descriptive enough to really drill down on what that specific indicator is. And again, that's okay. Where we were at this level of recommendation was really giving a higher level of overview of what aspects will we expect to see in a robust indicator system, with sort of the opportunity for our technical teams in their own individual papers then to drill down even further of how they would operationalize those. And that meant each of our teams ended up developing their own conceptual models and own set of indicator recommendations. So for example, this is a conceptual framework that was developed for the ag community to really think about how the climate system interacts with aspects of grazing lands and animal husbandry, cropping systems, how those flows go into food distribution and energy systems, and the like. So again, each of these ended up having a lot of detail, both in what those boxes were, but also the arrows for each of those systems. And you can think about each of those as giving an indication of what indicators might be important to be able to understand that more holistic system. So having produced all of those conceptual models, the recommendations, the research priorities, they went through more than 1 year of review and iteration and other things that we're just going to put in a black box. And that led to a beta launch. So this was one of the best things was we produced official guidance or advice to the federal government via a federal advisory report that was released. And based off of that, the U.S. Global Change Research Program and its 13 agencies built on that and took some of the prototypes that we developed and actually launched a prototype indicator system. So we got something into operations. So they built on that, and part of what we did was we identified the pieces that were critical. So graphics, so were key points, summaries, topics, agencies, a link to this metadata, which we talked about the importance of that metadata system, and then a way of providing feedback. And then we also had some prototype indicators, things that didn't make it into the proof of concept that was released by USGS. But for example, we worked with the CDC on thinking about how you integrate incidences of Lyme disease with a geographic range extent of tick species that carry Lyme disease. So you could really get a sense of where the geographic spread has happened over the past decade or so. And so for this, they were using data from 2000, 2005, and 2010, and you can really see that change. Now, again, is that climate? Part of it is. Part of it is also, increased reporting, increased awareness, and, changes in the geographic spread. But if you just use where that disease happens, you get these hot spots in places like LA, where the tick that carries Lyme disease is not based, because you have a lot of people there. So again, you have to think really carefully about how to develop these, and partnering with groups like the one at the CDC allowed us to really think strategically about how you can provide information that provides that baseline. And then, so one of the key pieces of this effort was not to develop something that was perfect and then launch it and just wipe our hands of it, but also to think about this iteratively and to integrate research into the process so we could develop a prototype, do some research, and then use that research to feed back in. So this is really thinking about how you use a software model, a design theory perspective, to think about the development of decision support systems. This is uncommonly done, in part because you have to admit you're not getting it right the first time. And that's okay. That's more of this model that we should be moving towards. If we want decision support products produced by federal agencies or other large groups to have stakeholder input, we need to release them and get that feedback and be willing to change it on the back end. So with this, part of what we did was we said, well, we used best available information to be able to develop and design these indicators. We've improved on the graphics, but now we want to understand how well do members of the public actually understand these graphics. So to give you a little bit of orientation, here are two of, well, let's look at this. So there were 14 indicators that were released within the U.S. Global Change Research Program pilot indicator system. If you see green, that means it's it's one of the top 4 that of scoring well. And you can think about these scores as almost like grades. It's a 0 through 1 scale, but you could almost kind of think about them as grades. If it got a red, it really underperformed. So a few things that performed well, like Vibrio, flash freeze season, these are fairly simplistic graphics that we kind of expected would perform well based off the key messages. Oh, sure, please.
Who's the public in this situation?
Yeah.
Is it a real public, or is it a person watching it?
Well, I would say both of those are publics. What we did was we used a survey.
Unbiased public versus biased public.
Oh, okay. A biased or unbiased. So what we did was we actually contract with a survey company. So all of this goes through a survey company. We get about 800 respondents or so we have enough power to be able to make judgments. And what we ask them to do is to find a U.S. audience. We oversample for college educated because we're biasing towards those who are more likely to be sort of decision makers, people who would pick up and use this information rather than just those who we want to understand it. And we ask for a gender balance. We don't give any other restrictions in that. And so, the survey company has about 3 million different participants that are part of its pool, and you have no say other than the constraints that you give it where it selects. You could create more constraints geographically, but we chose not to do that. So again, this is kind of like if someone were to pick it up and interpret it, would they broadly get it? And these two graphics, the annual greenhouse gas index and annual heating and cooling degree days, people have a hard time getting those. They're both abstract concepts, but the graphics are fairly complex. You have two axes here. You have a stack bar graph. You have gases that people might not fully understand what they mean. Annual heating and cooling degree days. You have these indicators here that give you a sense of how to interpret it, less energy, more energy. But you have basically two graphs that are superimposed that make it difficult to track it. So what we did was we sort of took these and we tore them up, as well as we took one graphic that was like commonly used within the U.S. National Climate Assessment to see if we could get some broad-based insights that would provide some actionable information for how to think about this moving forward. So one of these graphics, do you all recognize this one from the third National Climate Assessment? Contiguous U.S., observed U.S. temperatures, spatially disaggregated, as well as temporally disaggregated. So a pretty complex graphic, appeared in the New York Times. Kind of shocked they didn't like completely overhaul it. But part of what we were doing when we assessed this, baseline is like taking the graphic that was produced, how well do people understand it? Well, people got it was about a 40%. Not awesome. That's because there's a lot of information contained here. And think about how we take these kinds of graphics. We take them and we mull over them and we spend like minutes like dissecting them. That's not how the public takes graphics and information. And so if you have a key message, it's very likely to get lost if it's hidden within these more complex graphics. So what we did was we said, what's a big key message, which is we thought, how much has temperature changed in different regions in the U.S.? And so we tested one where we aggregated the time series. We tested one where we kept everything, but we aggregated the regions. And then we tested one where we aggregated both the regions as well as the temporal change. And what we found is if we can aggregate and we say this is a key message, it doesn't mean that any of this doesn't exist, but we think about what the key message we want the public to get is, you can basically jump them up 40%. So you can get them from an F to a B in terms of their understanding by really thinking about how you visually describe something that is important, that's a key message for these kinds of reports. Additionally, part of what we also did research on was the metadata systems. So within the original pilot, we had this link, and it went into the global change data.usgcrp.gov, Global Change Information System, GCIS. Is anyone familiar with that? Yes, so a few people are familiar with it. It's basically a machine-readable format for metadata, which is great for computers and horrible for people. And if you are trying to access the metadata for this, this is something that if you're expert in these systems, you're not doing that. You already know where to get the data. You probably work with the people who make the data. Getting access to the original data and those information systems are for people who are less familiar with it. And so what we did was we did intercept interviews. So we kind of stopped people at conferences. We did deep dive interviews with a couple of like experts and found out a couple of insights. But the actionable piece of information that we found out was if you just designed a metadata pop-out that was similar to what they had in the third National Climate Assessment, you could basically give people almost everything that they needed in a human-readable system that allows them to know whether or not they need to take a deeper dive into the machine-readable system. This is really powerful because, like, not only were we able to, like, create some new insights in the field of information studies where sort of how experts versus non-experts think about this was, like, sort of like a fundamental advancement, but we were able to, like, feed that back into some very pragmatic advice of, like, how you could actually, like, develop that metadata system in a very cost-efficient way that allows people to implement it. And I think my second biggest win was this didn't disappear. They actually are building off these indicator systems. There's a whole working group within the USGCRP. I mean, once you've developed these things and they become operational, they're out of our hands of many of the scientists here at the Academy. And so you just hope these things live on and build. And that's certainly what's happening here, I am hoping that we'll see more ecosystem and societally focused indicators as time moves on. But again, that's part of the reason why we're producing this special issue, is so we can be more prescriptive about what we think should be developed as this moves forward. So that's been 8+ years of my life. So what I want to give you a sense on is how we're building on that work, as well as some of the research directions my team has taken over the past little bit.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, Fernando.
So I'm curious as to how other communities outside the U.S., for example, European communities, how they deal with issues like this. Is there a parallel track, or they do similar things in terms of indicators, in terms of understanding what's the state of it outside of the U.S.?
Yeah.
We have a very particular situation with this type of information.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm curious as to what's going on.
Yeah. So indicators are really powerful because we use them as shortcuts to indicate what matters most to us, either for understanding or for decision making. So internationally, there's been a number of indicators that have been developed. Some of the research behind this, I would say, is the research related to indicators and decision support systems at large is really dispersed amongst lots of disciplinary fields. And so there's not like one concentrated disciplinary field where you can really say, this is what's happening and here's the gaps. Part of the reason why my team is multidisciplinary and why this whole field is multidisciplinary is you kind of have to like get rid of your just disciplinary blinders and say, I'm guessing someone else has already solved this problem somewhere. I just need to find some of the literatures where they might have some insights into it. And so, so I think the biggest thing to be concerned about or to be aware of when thinking about this internationally is this is really designed and focused for a US-centric audience. The way people interpret information, the way they visualize it, what colors and things of the sort ends up being more important, that has cultural significance to it. And so if you're designing it for other audiences, you have to be aware of that. What I will say is that a lot of the work that we've done has been based in part on some of the papers that have been developed based off of IPCC graphics and key messages. And what has been found with those is, for example, in the last IPCC report, the main key graphic, very few people understand it. And if you sort of like overhaul that graphic, you can actually significantly improve the understanding of the major key message of those graphics. So what I would say is the biggest insight I would glean from sort of the literature as it exists now, as well as our work, is that if you're producing something for a very diverse audience, getting people who have expertise in communication, decision support, visualizations, decision support tool development, boundary processes, and processes of engagement between scientists and policymakers from like the very beginning, as early as possible, is really critical if part of what you want is for that science to be used and implemented for more than just making a statement. And so that just means that having diversity of scholars in those fields who would have sensitivity to those cultural phenomenons would be really critical. I work predominantly in the US, so I couldn't speak to any one country beyond that. But so much of the sort of scientific climate assessment framing is geared towards US sort of dominates in that space, that part of the way that we frame this and thought about this is that we can think about how to create an ideal setup for the US. Part of what we're doing, even if the exact framing and insights might be different internationally, you end up creating a way of understanding where some of the underlying problems may lie. So sort of a diagnosis and a way of creating solutions. So current and future research I'm going to talk about four things, because these are the four major things. We have a couple of other smaller endeavors. So I'll talk about participatory-based climate indicators and coastal resilience. I'll talk about reducing failure time from interdependent infrastructure, improving ecological forecasts, and then evaluating decision support processes, both processes as well as tools. So over the past 5 years, I've had an NSF grant focus on sustainable adaptive gradients in the coastal environment, really thinking about how to develop a community of practice, how to develop research related to gray, green, and cultural infrastructure. And this came at the perfect time because it was right after Superstorm Sandy, and the regions that we're focused on were the ones that were hit all through the Caribbean region and then the northeast of the U.S. And that was coming right at the time where a lot of communities were thinking about built infrastructure solutions are not adequate for us to be thinking about resilience more holistically, as well as wanting to develop and think about solutions that are more robust in the face of a changing climate. So building off of this, we had a paper that developed a framework. We've been working with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources on operationalizing that and using that to both make decisions about what kind of coastal resilience programs to fund, as well as how to evaluate those programs. And then we've been building this into projects that were funded by the Maryland Sea Grant to really think about then how you expand that beyond just one use case into how you can think about it more regionally to really see how you can assess sort of climate adaptation efforts, not just on a project-by-project basis, but as a portfolio. So really trying to get at that question of like, are we working together towards solutions that we're hoping to see? That means that with this project that was funded by Sea Grant, and this is one that I'm going to continue working on while, as an affiliate here at ESSEC, Mike Gerst is going to take over as PI, and we've made really good strides in both developing the use case, but also thinking about how we expand on it. That's also fed into how we think about interdependent infrastructure systems. So this past year, my colleague Mike Gerst, as well as Allison Riley in Civil and Environmental Engineering, the three of us received a $750K grant from the National Science Foundation, focus on accelerating how we provide information to interdependent infrastructure systems. So infrastructure systems where there's connections between electricity and water systems, and then water systems back to electricity, so it's sort of a full feedback loop, so that we can figure out ways of reducing failure time. The whole crux of this project that's unique is like thinking about it as a decision scientist. We've been like totally thinking about the problem wrong. Because what we've been doing is we've been optimizing these systems. And I'm not telling you that optimization models aren't fun. I've certainly made a career doing some optimization models, and it's a lot of fun to think about like what would happen in the ideal. But what's happening in the ideal is not what's happening in reality. And so a lot of this project was thinking about how do we not just model sort of an academic ideal, but how do we understand how people are actually making decisions now and developing ways that we can move them to a more practical optimum. So understanding the mechanisms, the behavioral nudges that could be done, the policy interventions, the ways that we could incentivize information sharing to accelerate the recovery time of these infrastructure systems as a more collective system instead of as these individual silos. So that's a project that just got started. We're using the University of Maryland as our test case because facilities management has given us access to all their data and people. And we're hoping, we already have plans on actually taking this approach and scaling it to small scale communities and then thinking about even bigger communities as we gain insights through those step zones. Next, so I mentioned we published a paper in the Proceedings of PNAS, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences this past year, focused on ecological forecasting. And the whole idea behind this is how do we predict nature like we predict the weather? So really thinking about how we get to iterative, near-term ecological forecasts that are verifiable and where we can use our insights from collecting the data to improve our models. So the decision science piece of this is because we're now at the point where we can think about forecasts. It's really exciting, and like a way that we could think about operationalizing them and really understanding how good they are, not just projections so far out into the future, they're not relevant for decisions. That means that because we're making forecasts into the future and decisions are about at the future, we can think about how we develop indicators and model outputs. We can think about the temporal scale, the spatial scale that really links the ecological forecasts with decisions that are being made on the ground and how we can provide actionable, verifiable information. This is really phenomenal, and it creates like lots of information, lots of opportunities for research on value of information, whether or not it matters to get better information, how we think about operationalizing adaptive management in these learning cycles, how we think about evaluating and improving forecasts, and also thinking about like how do we then take those predictions and then feed them back into social system models so we could actually make predictions on changes in ecosystem services that would occur as a result of what we're forecasting. So really exciting opportunities. We have lots of proposals in the works related to this, and this is one of the things that NSF, NOAA, NASA, DOI has picked up on as something that they're viewing as a high priority in the near term. And then finally, this is my other big major NOAA project. Over the past few years, we've worked with the Climate Prediction Center to take the existing temperature and precipitation outlooks, diagnose why people misunderstand them, and then develop some actionable solutions that would allow us to make modifications. Unique to this effort, we basically developed a new approach using control versus treatment methods so that we could rigorously test whether or not modifications in the graphics actually improved the way people understood them. So that was a really important insight because it provided evidence-based information to help CPC know whether or not making the modifications would have any benefit. Additionally, for the graphic modifications, and this is the final one that was recommended, we worked really closely with the CPC forecasters, John Gottschalk, Scott Handel, Matt Rosenkrantz, and Dave DeWitt, to really make sure that if we're developing these insights, they actually develop the modified graphics so that it would feed into their operational systems. And that was really important. So again, we're not doing the academic ideal, we're doing the practical ideal of like what actually works given their time frame and what they need to produce these operational forecasts. So using this method, it actually got picked up by a number of folks who are interested in expanding on it. And one of those opportunities is actually working with the USGS. We have a proposal that's getting hopefully signed off by the Secretary of the Department of Interior in the next few weeks to fund us to work on their Water Watch products. Water Watch, Groundwater Watch, and Water Quality Watch, really thinking about how people use, how they understand those informations, diagnoses of problems, and developing solutions, not just for static images, but thinking about dynamic images. So this is really exciting because as we move to these more computer, user-driven interfaces, creates a real opportunity for people to be able to customize the information that they want. It also creates an opportunity for some of the key messages and some of the key insights to be lost because everything gets customized and you have like information overload. So really thinking critically about the defaults, how to structure it, how to create a user experience that matches with the expectations of your core user base while also expanding it for a wider range of people to engage with information. I think it's going to be some really exciting insights so we can move from understanding just static graphics to these more user-controlled dynamic graphic interfaces. So that's going to keep me busy for a while. But I think the biggest thing to think about is that as we think about this, and as you hear the word decision support, that doesn't just mean tools. A lot of times when we're working here, we think a lot about tools, models, scenarios, indicators, other things that we can develop. But if we're really trying to get to effective decision making, decision support processes and these processes of engaging across multiple scientific communities as well as stakeholders and decision makers are absolutely key, and sometimes even more important if you're trying to get science into decision making. And so with that, let me stop and ask if there's any questions. Thank you. Thanks everyone online.
Questions?
I'm also happy to stick around for those of you that want to chat individually. And for those online, feel free to send me an email. My email address is makenney, Kenney, @umn.edu. And if you want to know more about our research program, there's the URL right there.
Great. So let's ramp up, and thanks to the speaker again.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.